everyone. Welcome. Hi, Kathy from Los Angeles. Good to see you today. I'm super excited for this project. So summer is officially here, and what better to sew to kick off summer than a drink koozie, because there's nothing worse than sitting by a pool and having your drink get hot. So this class might be a little shorter because this project is super easy. So if you're brand new to sewing and you're looking for like a beginner 5-minute project, it's pretty simple and anyone can make a koozie. So I did do embroidery on these. I'm actually going to switch it back to this camera to show you guys how fun these are. This one says sipping on sunshine, stay salty. The cool thing about these are they can be reversible. So they have Velcro, and I got this spray out of the fridge not that long ago and they're still pretty cold. And so if you don't want to show the embroidered side, or you just want to like switch it up with two different prints, you can switch it over and change your koozies that way. So it's kind of fun if you have a party or custom, like baby showers, things like that. It's a great, easy sewing project. So to start off, you will just need, cotton fabric, and you're also going to need, for this project, some insulated batting. So this is called Insul-Bright. They sell it right at Michael's. I'm going to kind of switch the camera again. You can kind of tell it has this insulated material. So how it works is it can keep your drinks cool, as well as if you use it for hot projects, it's good for like if you're making oven mitts, things like that. So oven Insul-Bright can be used for a lot of different things. Now, if you were to use just regular batting, you could still in theory make a koozie, but it wouldn't have that insulated material to help keep it cold. So starting off, I'm not going to go into full embroidery today. I'm not going to show you all that. If you are interested in how to do the embroidery and use the SE9 180, this is the machine I'm using today. This is one of Singer's current top of the line embroidery machines. It's super easy to use, lots of functionality with it. This amazing touchscreen here. I have it set up for sewing today, but if you were to use it for the embroidery, you would pop this off, put on your embroidery unit, and create designs. So I did do a class a couple months ago where I showed fully how to use this machine with the embroidery function, how to hoop your fabric, all of that. So if you're wanting to learn how to, fully embroider your projects, I would recommend checking out that class. I use the same machine and everything. Now, starting over here. So I already cut up my fabric and embroidered these ones here. This one, I'm going to start off making Squeeze the Day. Now, I already cut everything to size, and in my project write-up, which should be with this project, it has the dimensions of the fabric. So you could use a variety of materials, like if you wanted to use a thicker kind of canvas or denim fabric. I use just regular cotton fabric today. Now the dimensions of these are 11 inches long by 5 inches wide, and you're going to need two different fabrics for your front and back. If you could do them the same, but like I said, it can also be reversible. So if you want to switch it up, I recommend using two different fabrics. And if you don't have embroidery, you could do it just plain, or you could even use vinyl. There's lots of different ways you could switch it up and put a design on your koozie. And also you could use, let me actually, sorry, I need to hide this. There you go. You could also use a stitch setting on your machine called stitch programming, if you have that, which allows you to write out kind of a mock embroidery with your stitches if you wanted to put kind of a smaller font on your koozie. So to start off, let me go back here. So what you're going to do first is we're going to sandwich our Insul-Bright in between our two pieces of fabric. So kind of getting started, you're going to actually take your two main pieces and put them together, good side touching, just like this. Then you're going to take your Insul-Bright. Now, I actually did two variations to kind of test it out. So if you want your koozie to not be quite as thick, this one right here, I used just one piece of Insul-Bright in the middle. And you can tell it's not quite as thick as this one. And it honestly is a little looser on the can. So I would recommend using two pieces of Insul-Bright, and it'll give it that extra insulation. But if you want to make it not as thick, that's another option. You would just use one clipped on either one side. But I'm going to use 2 pieces of Insul-Bright. So first, you're gonna have your 2 main fabrics sandwiched or put together with a good side spacing. And then you're gonna take an piece of Insul-Bright on each side. So you're gonna have Insul-Bright all around on the outside and your 2 fabric pieces sandwiched in the middle. So let me kind of even these out here. And obviously I didn't do a super great job when I cut this out of trying to get this centered. When it wraps around the can, it will still be centered in its own way, but just keep in mind when you do cut out your pieces, if you do embroidery, you're gonna wanna have a larger piece of fabric first that you embroider, and then you'll cut it to size afterwards. So just some things to keep in mind. So once you get the fabric sandwiched in the middle, I'm gonna go ahead and clip it up, or you could pin it. So I'm just gonna do that really quick. And some of my edges are a little longer here. I'll trim those up in a second. And you're gonna also need VELCRO, which you can also get at Michael's. Now, VELCRO, I recently learned, is actually a trademark license name of the brand. It's also called, I think, Hook and Loop if you buy another type of VELCRO, but you don't need too much. I would say you're just gonna need the width of the koozie itself. I'm gonna go ahead and clip this up. And if you have kids or wanting to teach kids to get into sewing, this is a great beginner project for all. So I am going to just kind of clip this little edge here just a tad bit. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna actually just sew around this rectangle here, and you're gonna leave a hole at the top edge. I would say about 3 to 4 inches or so, right about here. So what you'll do is you'll start at one side of this top edge. You'll do your forward back stitch. You're going to sew to each corner, and you're going to pivot all the way around till you get back to the opposite hole, the opposite side of your hole. Now we're going to use about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all throughout, and you're going to sew through all the layers. So I'm going to switch back to my machine camera. Now we're just going to be using a standard straight stitch for this, but I am going to bump up my stitch length just a tad bit to about 3.5, because we are sewing through these multiple layers. So again, as I said, I'm going to start on one side of my hole. So I'm going to start right here, go all the way around and end at this opposite side hole. And my 2 fabric pieces are sandwiched in the middle. Right about here, it's 1/4 of an inch. Every time I get to that corner, I'm going to have my needle down, pivot, turn. And it's okay that this little edge is hanging off. I'll trim that later. I did cut my pieces in a hurry earlier, and they were a little, so. I think I'm sliding off a little bit, trying to not get in front of the camera here. And sometimes this stuff will slide. You could use like a walking foot, which also helps with multiple layers to kind of keep them from shifting how my batting is shifting a little bit. Again, make sure you leave that hole. So I'm going to do one more little back stitch at the end and then snip. This is a great function I love on this machine, the little snip button. So that way you don't have to cut your thread and it just comes right out. So, all right.
Someone asked if you're doing a 5x8 seam.
I'm using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It might look a little wider. I probably wasn't perfectly on, but about a 1/4 of an inch. Now, and I did this measurement for a standard soda can, I guess you would say. So that's kind of the width that I did. But if you wanted to make koozies for like, a taller beer bottle or, different types of shapes of cans, I would just adjust your measurement of the rectangle that you're cutting accordingly. Like I actually I first just cut some fabric and wrapped it around and kind of played around to get my measurement. So if you have, a skinnier can or like those wine seltzer type cans, feel free to maybe cut it a bit longer, play around and adjust, but just keep your seam allowance in mind that it will shrink some as well. So before I turn it the right side out, this is how it looks. I'm gonna go ahead and snip my corners just a tad bit. I'm just gonna snip this excess too. And when I say snip corners, I mean don't snip into it, but just close enough to it so that way when we flip it right side out, the corners will be more defined. And when I did that, I'm going to now flip it right side out, but you want to make sure you go through this way because sometimes you can actually flip it the opposite way, but you want to make sure your two outside fabrics are going to be showing. So this is the fun part of sewing, whenever you flip something right side out. And I don't have my little bodkin here to help kind of push your corners out. Usually in class, I say use a chopstick or something. You can use your scissors, but you just have to be very careful you don't accidentally poke a hole. But you want to use something that has a little bit of a point, especially because we have these extra layers to help push out these corners. And don't laugh at my nails, you guys. I literally lost my thumb. Okay, so right now it looks like this. It's a little wonky, but you're gonna go over to your iron and give it a good press. And where this, oh gosh, I found all my cords. Where this fold is, this opening, what you're gonna do is, as any sewing project, you want to fold it in just like this, so both the edges meet, and then give it a good press all throughout, get it nice and flat. And I always say roll the edges, and if you see here, this is something that I missed. I actually have a little hole. So I'm going to actually flip it back right side out really quick. This class, I said it's for beginners and you would think I would know how to, but what I did is I got a little too close to the seam allowance and I couldn't see all of the layers through the batting, so I didn't catch that bottom layer. So I'm just gonna sew back over that really quick. Gotta find where it was. There, the top. I'm just gonna go back here really quick. So before you close the hole shut, as you're pressing it and rolling around your edges, I would double check and make sure you caught all of the layers. And there. So I'm just gonna sew a tad bit lower than where I was, and hopefully I'll catch that one layer that I missed. Start kind of a little before it, sew right below it. Now I'll flip it right side out again. I would recommend to avoid that, to not be like me where I cut these up right before class. I didn't use a rotary cutter and sometimes it's hard, you know, your edges don't get quite as straight. And that's what happened. But yep, now I caught it and the little hole is gone. So I'm just gonna push these corners back out. I don't know if you can hear that, but you can hear the Insul-Bright. It kind of sounds like stuffing or so. I'm gonna go over to my iron. Here. Down here. You guys see the iron? Okay, yeah, it's in the frame. And I'm gonna really press this hole nice and flat, so when I sew it closed, it won't have like a poof. All right, so now it's gonna look like this. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna do a top stitch. Now I'm not gonna do a top stitch on the side edges because that's where I'm gonna add the Velcro, but I am gonna do a top stitch along these two top and bottom edges. One, it will just kind of give a decorative look to it, make it look cleaner, but also at the same time, it's gonna close the hole. So I'm gonna kind of show you. You see here the two top stitch along the top and the bottom, and then next it will be sewing on the Velcro. And for the top stitch, you know, seam allowance isn't really as much of a thing, it's more so your needle position. So I want to do a top stitch as close as I can relate to the bottom edge. One, that way it will close the hole perfectly. So say if you were to sew a top stitch and you did it further in, you would still have a weird little flap opening here. And you don't want that to happen. You want it to be sewn right up along the edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my needle position over. So I'm currently in the middle, but I'm going to pop it over to the right. And you'll see my needle just moves all the way to the right. So that way, as I sew along that top stitch, I'll be closer to the right edge. Now, if you don't have a machine like mine where I had a needle position button, so this gets, it's a little blurry. I have a button here that just allows me to switch between the right, all the way to the left, all the way to the right, and then right in the middle, which is super convenient. I love that setting. But if you don't have that setting on your machine, you might have a mechanical machine or anything like that. What you do is if your machine is in a straight stitch, you go to your width setting and you just adjust the width of your stitch because it's in a straight stitch. It doesn't really matter, but that setting will move your needle position as well. So now I'm just going to sew right along the top and the bottom edge, giving it a nice top stitch. And I am going to bump my stitch length up again to about 3 because I'm sewing through multiple layers and it's a bit thicker. When I get to the whole part, I'm just going to go a tad bit slower so I make sure I'm catching both sides of my fabric. And you can tell that was a thicker spot in that corner. When I put my needle down, it kind of got a little stuck. So that's what happened there. All right, so let's get trim that. And then I'm gonna do one more top stitch along this opposite edge. And because again, I'm turning it this way, I can keep my needle position in that same spot.
Kathy asked if she were to quilt it, would you suggest doing that before sewing it together or do it at the end?
You mean like make a quilt top and then turn that into a koozie? I guess if you
I
were saying.
think so.
Yeah, so I would first make your quilt block, whatever, make sure it's at least 11 inches wide and wide enough to cut out the shape. And then I would cut it, and that could be either your front piece, or if you have enough for two, that could be your front and back piece. But yeah, exactly. If you did have like an old quilt and you wanted to upcycle it, you could do that too. I would say if it has batting in it, it might be too thick to add the Insul-Bright, but you could still use that as a koozie. It just won't be as insulated, but it would still work in theory. I love that idea. A quilted koozie would be pretty cool and unique. I feel like I've never really seen a quilted koozie. Or you just mean quilt stitching, not piecing fabrics together. I'm not sure if I understand what you mean by quilt stitching. Like, top stitching in a quilt pattern, like a decorative stitch. You could definitely use a decorative stitch as well for your top stitching. Yes, sorry. Yeah, if you wanted to do the decorative stitch along here, yeah, totally could do that. All right, so now I have my top stitching done, and now we're gonna add the Velcro. So I'm gonna kind of show you guys on this camera. So first, you're gonna wanna take your Velcro, and what you're gonna do is, first I would just take your Velcro, open it up, and it doesn't really matter which side, you're gonna start with one or the other. So we're gonna first put one here, and again, I cut these kind of just on the go. So if they are a little longer, just trim them down to size. So I'm just gonna trim this a bit so it's just a little bit fits better. If you even want it to kind of match up with where the top stitching is, that's fine too. Now I would recommend make sure you get Velcro that there is like Velcro that has sticky residue on it to help stick it to stuff, but I didn't use that because typically that kind of makes your needles a bit sticky and it gets jammed up sometimes. There are ones that have that adhesive that say they're okay for sewing, so I would just keep that in mind. I just got the non-stick Velcro. So first you're gonna take one side of your Velcro and you can use a pin or a clip and just something to hold it in place on the one side. And what we're gonna do is first we're gonna sew kind of like how we just sewed around the rectangle. You're gonna do a smaller sewing of a rectangle here and just sew in the Velcro. So I would recommend still having your needle position kind of near the outside edge, but you're just gonna sew all the way around this rectangle and sew in the Velcro. And then once you do that, we're gonna grab our opposite piece and we're gonna sew it on the opposite side so it matches up like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and just sew this first side. And you can see here my needle position, it's in a good spot, so I can still stay on that outer edge of the Velcro. You know, there's a couple ways you could sew on the Velcro. Sometimes we'll like to do like kind of an X through the middle, but I'm just gonna go and do an outline of the whole shape. And let's make it zoom in a little better. So you guys can see. I'm gonna bump my stitch length up just a tad bit again as well. And you'll pivot at each corner. Now, when you get to the end here, you'll basically sew back to where you meet up with where you started. I'm gonna actually go just a tad bit up. And when I get up here, I'm gonna overlap and I'm gonna do a really good back stitch a couple of times and go forward and back to really secure. I keep getting at that weird corner where my needle wants to stop. To really secure the Velcro, because you know, when you open and close something a lot, it could rip off. So that extra back stitch will help with that. To really have your Velcro in a good position. All right, I'm just gonna trim a little tad bit of my Velcro. Okay. Get up this camera. So, and I would always recommend when you do this part, I hate that this isn't centered. Judge me. When you go to this part, I would recommend having a can or whatever you're gonna put it around to kind of gauge to make sure you're sewing right. Because I actually had talkies in an in-person class, and two of the girls accidentally sewed the Velcro to this opposite side. So you want to make sure you're sewing your other side of your Velcro basically on the other side of whatever you sewed this side to, you're going to sew it on the opposite end, but on the back side of the fabric. So now I'm going to sew, same thing I did here, I'm going to sew this Velcro on this opposite end. So that way, when I clasp it, you'll see it matches up. I'm just going to, again, trim my length down a tad bit. That. And same technique. And with these thicker fabrics, one thing I want to mention is sometimes we'll start like this, and I don't know if you can see how my foot is on a slant. Sometimes if you start on a very corner and if it's a bulky, thicker material, your presser foot can get kind of stuck on that corner. So I recommend starting up a little bit so your presser foot is level. I feel like you guys can't see this, but I'm actually wearing little heels today, and every time I press the foot pedal, I'm like not giving it the right amount of force because my heels, so why it might seem like it's starting weird. All right, so I'm gonna do that good back stitch at the end. Make sure I really secure that Velcro. It's going to trim this up. But as you can see, I just, minus the cutting of the shapes and doing the embroidery, this was super easy, quick project. And if you were hosting an event or a party and making a bunch of custom koozies, a pool party, or even gifts, easy beginner project. So now the real test, gonna put it around my can. Voila, it's gonna keep it cold. And basically that's the project. So does anyone have any other questions or anything? No? All right, well, I hope you guys all go home and make these this summer, keep your drinks cool. And yeah, that's a wrap.